Sarah Martinez had dreamed of her perfect wedding day since she was a little girl. At 28, she finally found her soulmate in David Chen, a successful businessman who owned several restaurants across the city. Their love story began 2 years earlier when Sarah, working as an interior designer, was hired to renovate one of David's establishments. What started as professional meetings over coffee and blueprints slowly blossomed into stolen glances, lingering conversations, and eventually, a proposal under the stars at their favorite rooftop restaurant. The wedding planning consumed Sarah's life for 8 months. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the ivory silk dress that took 3 fittings to perfect to the handwritten calligraphy on 200 invitation cards. The venue was a historic mansion overlooking the harbor, with gardens that bloomed with white roses and baby's breath. Sarah's best friend, Elena Rodriguez, had flown in from Barcelona to be her maid of honor, and David's younger brother Marcus would serve as best man. Everything seemed perfect until 3 weeks before the wedding, when Sarah noticed David acting strangely. He would receive mysterious phone calls at odd hours, speaking in hushed tones before quickly hanging up when she entered the room. His usual warm smile seemed forced, and he often appeared distracted during their final wedding preparations. When Sarah asked about it, David would brush off her concerns, claiming work stress was getting to him. The first real sign of trouble came when Sarah decided to surprise David at his newest restaurant location downtown. She had picked up his favorite Thai takeout and planned to share lunch with him in his office. As she walked through the back entrance using her key, she heard voices coming from the storage room. One voice belonged to David, but it was strained and nervous in a way she had never heard before. The other voice was deep, gravelly, and spoke with a thick Italian accent. Sarah quietly moved closer to the partially open door, her heart beginning to race. Through the crack, she could see David standing rigidly, while a large man in an expensive suit gestured aggressively. The stranger had salt and pepper hair slicked back and wore gold rings on multiple fingers. What Sarah heard next made her blood run cold. "You think you can just disappear, David? You think marriage is going to protect you?" the man said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. "My boss doesn't care about your wedding plans. You owe us $200,000, and Salvatore Benedetti doesn't forgive debts." David's voice shook as he replied, "I told you, I need more time. The restaurants are doing well, but I can't liquidate everything overnight without raising suspicions. Sarah doesn't know about any of this, and I want to keep it that way." The stranger laughed coldly. "Your pretty little fiancé is going to find out soon enough. Maybe we should invite ourselves to your wedding. I'm sure she'd love to meet your business partners." Sarah's hands trembled as she held the takeout bags. The David she knew was honest, hard-working, and transparent about everything in his life. This conversation revealed a completely different person. Someone involved with dangerous people who spoke about debts and threats. She had never heard the name Salvatore Benedetti, but the way it was spoken sent chills down her spine. She quietly backed away from the door and slipped out of the restaurant the same way she had entered. Once in her car, Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Her mind raced with questions. How did David owe such a massive amount of money? Who was Salvatore Benedetti? What kind of business dealings was her future husband involved in that she knew nothing about? Over the next few days, Sarah found herself studying David's every move, searching for clues she might have missed. She noticed that some of his restaurant locations seemed unusually busy with well-dressed men who didn't appear to be typical customers. These men often arrived in expensive cars and spent hours in private dining rooms with David. When Sarah mentioned these observations casually, David would quickly change the subject or make excuses about business meetings with potential investors. The wedding preparations continued, but Sarah felt like she was living in a dream that was slowly turning into a nightmare. She went through the motions of finalizing catering details, confirming flower arrangements, and attending her bridal shower, but her mind was constantly occupied with the conversation she had overheard. She considered confronting David directly, but feared what she might discover. Part of her hoped there was a reasonable explanation that would make everything normal again. Elena noticed Sarah's distracted behavior during the bachelorette party planning. As they sat in Sarah's apartment addressing wedding favor boxes, Elena finally asked the question that had been bothering her for days. "What's wrong with you lately? You look like you haven't slept in weeks, and you keep spacing out during conversations. This should be the happiest time of your life." Sarah wanted desperately to confide in her best friend, but she couldn't bring herself to say the words aloud. Instead, she blamed wedding stress and promised Elena that everything would be fine once the ceremony was over. Elena didn't seem convinced, but she respected Sarah's privacy and focused on being supportive during the final weeks of preparation. The breaking point came exactly 1 week before the wedding. Sarah had gone to David's apartment to pick up his suit for the final fitting when she discovered a manila envelope hidden beneath a stack of restaurant invoices on his desk. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing photographs that made her stomach drop. The pictures showed David entering and leaving various locations around the city, but he wasn't alone. A stunning brunette woman was with him in every single photograph. The woman was clearly not a business associate. In some pictures, David had his arm around her waist. In others, they were holding hands or sharing intimate conversations over dinner. The timestamps on the photographs showed they were taken over the past 6 months throughout Sarah and David's engagement period. The final photograph in the stack showed David and the woman kissing passionately outside what appeared to be an expensive hotel. Sarah's legs gave out, and she collapsed into David's desk chair, still clutching the photographs. The room seemed to spin around her as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. Not only was her fiancé involved with dangerous people and massive debts, but he was also having an affair with another woman during their engagement. Everything she thought she knew about David and their relationship was a lie. As she sat there in shock, Sarah heard the sound of keys in the front door. David was returning to his apartment earlier than expected. She quickly shoved the photographs back into the envelope and placed it exactly where she had found it. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain David would hear it when he entered the room. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" David asked, seeming surprised and slightly nervous to find her in his apartment. "I came to get your suit for the fitting," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "I was just checking your desk to see if you had the appointment card." David moved quickly to his desk, subtly checking to make sure nothing had been disturbed. "I have the appointment information saved in my phone. You didn't need to look through my papers." The way he said it, with a hint of suspicion and protectiveness, confirmed Sarah's worst fears. David was definitely hiding something significant, and now she knew it involved both criminal connections and another woman. As she picked up his suit from the closet, Sarah realized that her dream wedding was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with impossible decisions. Should she confront David about the affair and the mob connections? Should she call off the wedding with only a week's notice, losing deposits and devastating both families? Should she try to investigate further to understand the full extent of David's deception? What Sarah didn't know was that her discovery of the photographs had set in motion a chain of events that would soon spiral completely out of control, putting her own life in danger and revealing secrets that went far deeper than she could have ever imagined. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather, but Sarah felt like she was preparing for her own execution rather than the happiest day of her life. She had spent the previous week in a state of emotional turmoil, going through the motions of final preparations while internally debating whether to go through with the ceremony. Elena had arrived 3 days earlier and immediately sensed something was seriously wrong. "You look like you're going to throw up," Elena said as she helped Sarah into her wedding dress. This isn't normal pre-wedding jitters. What's really going on? Sarah finally broke down and told Elena everything. The overheard conversation about debts and threats, the mysterious business associates, and most devastatingly, the photographs of David with another woman. Elena listened in stunned silence, her face growing pale as the full scope of David's deception became clear. "We have to call this off," Elena said immediately. "Sarah, you cannot marry this man. He's lying to you about everything. And you said these people sounded dangerous. What if you're putting yourself at risk?" But Sarah had already invested so much in this wedding, emotionally, financially, and socially. 200 guests were already arriving at the venue. Her parents had flown in from Colorado, and David's extended family had traveled from across the country. The thought of facing everyone and explaining why the wedding was canceled seemed impossible. "I'll confront him after the ceremony," Sarah decided. "Maybe there's an explanation I haven't considered. Maybe the photographs aren't what they seem." Elena shook her head but realized Sarah was too overwhelmed to think clearly. She decided to stay close and watch for any signs of danger during the wedding festivities. The ceremony took place in the mansion's rose garden as planned. Sarah walked down the aisle in her perfect dress, forcing a smile as she approached David at the altar. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, but Sarah now noticed the nervous sweat on his forehead and the way his eyes kept scanning the crowd of guests. When they exchanged vows, David's voice trembled slightly, and Sarah wondered if it was emotion or fear. The reception began without incident. The band played beautifully, the food was delicious, and guests seemed to be enjoying themselves. Sarah tried to lose herself in the celebration, dancing with her father and posing for photographs with the wedding party. For brief moments, she almost forgot about the dark secrets she had discovered. Everything changed during the dinner service. Sarah was sitting at the head table when she noticed several men in expensive suits entering the reception hall. They were clearly not wedding guests. Their presence had an intimidating quality that immediately caught the attention of other attendees. David saw them at the same time and went completely white. The men approached the head table with confident strides. The leader was the same man Sarah had seen threatening David in the restaurant storage room. Up close, he was even more intimidating, with cold, dark eyes and scars on his knuckles that suggested a history of violence. "Congratulations on your wedding, David," the man said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm Tony Benedetti, a business associate of your husband's. We brought a wedding gift." Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was clearly a member of the Benedetti family David owed money to. The gift was obviously not a present, but a threat. She watched David's hands shake as he stood to greet the unwelcome visitors. "Tony, this isn't the time or place," David whispered urgently. "We agreed to discuss business after my honeymoon." Tony's smile was cruel and predatory. "Business doesn't take honeymoons, my friend. Besides, I thought your beautiful wife should meet the whole family." That's when Sarah saw her. The brunette woman from the photographs walked into the reception hall, wearing a stunning red dress that commanded attention. She was even more beautiful in person, with confident posture and an expensive handbag that suggested she was accustomed to luxury. The woman walked directly to Tony's side and slipped her arm through his. "This is my daughter, Francesca," Tony announced, his voice carrying across the reception hall as conversations began to quiet. "She's been working very closely with David on some special projects." The word "closely" was spoken with deliberate emphasis that made Sarah's stomach lurch. The implications were crystal clear. Not only was David having an affair, but he was involved romantically with the daughter of a Mafia boss. The debt he owed wasn't just business, it was personal, complicated by a relationship that had clearly gone wrong. Francesca's eyes met Sarah's across the table, and there was no mistaking the triumph in her expression. She was enjoying this moment, savoring the destruction of Sarah's wedding day. When she spoke, her voice was sweet, but venomous. "David has told me so much about you," Francesca said to Sarah. "He's been very conflicted about today. Haven't you, darling?" The endearment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Guests at nearby tables were starting to stare, sensing the tension but not understanding what was happening. Sarah's parents looked confused and concerned from their seats at the family table. David stood frozen between the two women, his face a mask of terror and shame. He finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, I can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like." But Tony wasn't finished with his performance. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the reception table in front of David. "Here's the accounting of what you owe us, including interest and penalties for late payment. $250,000 due immediately." The amount had grown by $50,000 since Sarah had overheard the original conversation. She realized that David's financial situation was far worse than she had initially understood. He didn't just owe money to dangerous people. He was drowning in debt with no clear way to repay it. Elena had been watching the confrontation from the maid of honor's seat and immediately recognized the danger. She quietly signaled to some of the male wedding guests, including David's brother Marcus and Sarah's cousin Jake, both of whom were large men with military backgrounds. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Other guests were whispering among themselves, and Sarah's parents were starting to rise from their seats, clearly intending to intervene. Sarah knew she had to make a decision quickly before the situation escalated into something truly dangerous. "I need to speak with my husband privately," Sarah announced, standing up from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "Perhaps we could move this conversation somewhere more appropriate." Tony laughed coldly. "How sweet. The bride wants to have a private chat. Unfortunately, business is business, and this matter needs to be resolved tonight." That's when Francesca dropped the final bombshell. She pulled out her phone and showed the screen to Sarah, displaying what appeared to be a video message. "David sent me this yesterday morning," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think you should know what he really thinks about your marriage." Sarah's hands trembled as she reluctantly looked at the phone screen. The video showed David in what appeared to be a hotel room, speaking directly to the camera. His voice was clear and unmistakable as he said words that shattered Sarah's heart completely. "Francesca, I know I have to go through with this wedding for appearance's sake, but you know you're the one I really love. Once I can access Sarah's trust fund and get us out of this debt situation, we can finally be together properly. She's just a means to an end." The words hit Sarah like bullets. Not only had David been lying about the affair, but her entire relationship had been a calculated scheme to access her family's money. Her trust fund, which she had planned to use for their future home and children, was actually David's planned solution to his gambling debts and mob connections. The reception hall had gone completely silent as nearby guests processed what they had just heard. Sarah's parents were now on their feet and moving toward the head table, their faces showing a mixture of rage and protective concern. Other family members and friends were also beginning to stand, creating a potentially volatile situation with Tony's men still present. Sarah looked around the room at all the people who had come to celebrate what they thought was the beginning of her happy marriage. Instead, they were witnessing the complete destruction of her life and the revelation that she had been nothing more than a target in an elaborate con game. The most terrifying realization was yet to come. As Sarah processed the full extent of David's betrayal, she began to understand that she might now be in physical danger. If David had been planning to use her trust fund to pay off the Benedetti family, and that plan was now obviously ruined, what would happen to both of them? Tony and his men didn't look like people who accepted disappointment gracefully. Sarah's wedding day, which had begun with hopes and dreams, was turning into a nightmare that threatened not just her emotional well-being, but potentially her very life. The reception hall erupted in chaos as Sarah's family and friends finally understood what was happening. Her father, Robert Martinez, a retired police captain, immediately recognized the dangerous nature of the situation and began moving people toward the exits. Elena grabbed Sarah's arm and tried to pull her away from the head table, but Tony's men had positioned themselves strategically around the room, blocking the main entrances. "Nobody leaves until we settle our business," Tony announced, his voice cutting through the confused murmur of wedding guests. "David here has some explaining to do, and his new wife needs to understand her role in fixing this situation." Sarah finally found her voice, though it shook with anger and fear. "I don't have any role in David's problems. I didn't know about any of this, and I certainly don't owe you anything." Francesca laughed coldly. "Oh, sweetheart, you married him. That makes his debts your debts. Plus, we know all about your family's money. Your trust fund could solve everyone's problems very quickly." That's when Sarah's mother, Maria Martinez, stepped forward. Despite being a small woman in her 50s, she faced down Tony and his intimidating crew with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her child. "You will not threaten my daughter," Maria said firmly. "She is not responsible for whatever mess that man has created. If you have business with him, handle it elsewhere." Tony seemed amused by Maria's courage, but also irritated by the interference. "Lady, you don't understand who you're talking to. The Benedetti family doesn't negotiate with civilians." Robert Martinez had been quietly observing the situation while discreetly texting messages on his phone. His police training and connections were about to prove invaluable. He approached the group calmly, but with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to handling dangerous situations. "Actually, I think you're the one who doesn't understand," Robert said. "I've already contacted the FBI task force that's been investigating your family's activities. They're very interested in this public display of extortion and intimidation." Tony's confident expression faltered slightly. Public confrontations were bad for business, especially when law enforcement might become involved. But he had committed too much to back down now, and David's debt was real regardless of the circumstances. "You're bluffing, old man," Tony replied, "and even if you're not, we'll be long gone before anyone official arrives." That's when the situation took an even more dangerous turn. Francesca whispered something urgently in Tony's ear, and his face darkened with anger. She had apparently told him something that changed his entire approach to the situation. "It seems there's been a development," Tony announced. "My daughter just informed me that David has been skimming money from our business operations to fund this little wedding charade. The debt isn't $250,000 anymore. It's closer to $400,000. David's face went ashen. "That's not true. I never skimmed anything. The restaurant accounts are clean." Francesca pulled out a tablet and showed the screen to everyone at the head table. Financial records displayed clear evidence of money being moved from accounts associated with Benedetti operations into David's personal business accounts. The amounts were substantial, and the transfers had been happening for months. "You've been stealing from us while pretending to be my boyfriend," Francesca said, her voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice? Did you think you could rob the Benedetti family and then disappear into married life?" Sarah realized that David's deception went far deeper than an affair and gambling debts. He had been actively stealing from organized crime figures while simultaneously planning to use her trust fund as his escape plan. She was married to a man who had essentially signed both of their death warrants. The wedding guests were becoming increasingly agitated. Some were trying to leave despite the blocked exits, while others were pulling out phones to record the confrontation. Elena had managed to call 911, but emergency responders would need time to arrive at the remote mansion location. That's when Tony made the decision that would change everything. "Since David has decided to steal from us and his new wife doesn't seem cooperative about accessing her trust fund, we'll have to motivate them differently." He gestured to two of his men, who immediately moved towards Sarah. Their intention was clear: They planned to kidnap her as leverage to ensure David's compliance and force access to her family's money. Robert Martinez stepped between the men and his daughter, his police training taking over despite his retirement. "You'll have to go through me first." The confrontation might have turned violent, but Elena had been thinking quickly while everyone else was focused on the financial revelations. She had remembered that the mansion's security system included panic buttons connected directly to the local sheriff's department. She managed to activate the system while the attention was focused on the main drama. Within seconds, alarm sirens began wailing throughout the mansion, and the security lights started flashing in the distinctive pattern that indicated law enforcement had been automatically notified. The mansion's location meant that sheriff's deputies would arrive within minutes. Tony realized that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. "Change of plans," he announced. "David, you're coming with us right now. Your wife can access that trust fund and wire the money to our accounts if she wants to see you alive again." Two of Tony's men grabbed David roughly, ignoring his protests and struggles. Sarah watched in horror as her new husband, despite all his lies and betrayals, was being dragged away by dangerous criminals. "Wait!" Sarah called out desperately. "I'll give you the money! Just don't hurt him!" Even after everything David had done to her, Sarah couldn't watch him be kidnapped without trying to help. Her compassionate nature overrode her anger and pain, at least in that moment of crisis. Tony paused, considering the offer. "You have 48 hours to transfer $400,000 to an account we'll specify. If the money isn't there, David disappears permanently. And if you go to the police beyond what's already happened here tonight, you'll never see him again." Francesca seemed disappointed that her father was accepting money instead of taking more dramatic revenge, but business was apparently more important than her personal vendetta against David. As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Tony's crew prepared to leave with their captive. David looked back at Sarah with an expression that might have been genuine remorse, but it was too late for apologies. "Sarah, I never meant for any of this to happen," he called out as they dragged him toward a service exit. "I'm sorry for everything." Sheriff's deputies burst into the reception hall just as Tony's men disappeared through the back of the mansion with David. The timing was too close. Law enforcement missed the actual kidnapping by mere seconds. The next several hours were a blur of police interviews, FBI involvement, and family crisis management. Sarah had to explain the entire situation multiple times to different investigators while still wearing her wedding dress, which had become a symbol of the worst day of her life instead of the best. Elena never left Sarah's side during the questioning, providing moral support and helping to clarify details when Sarah became too overwhelmed to think clearly. Robert Martinez used his law enforcement connections to ensure that the case was taken seriously and that proper resources were allocated to finding David. The investigation revealed that the Benedetti family was already under federal surveillance for multiple crimes, including money laundering, extortion, and racketeering. David's kidnapping had inadvertently provided law enforcement with new evidence and opportunities to build their case. More shocking discoveries emerged over the following days. David's restaurants had been fronts for money laundering operations, and he had been skimming funds while also cooking the books to hide the illegal activities. His relationship with Francesca hadn't just been an affair. It had been his entry point into organized crime, which had gradually consumed his entire life. Sarah faced an agonizing decision about the ransom money. While part of her wanted David to face the consequences of his choices, she couldn't live with the knowledge that she might have saved his life and chose not to. Against the advice of law enforcement and her family, Sarah decided to cooperate with the kidnapper's demands. The money transfer was arranged through intermediaries with FBI agents monitoring the transaction in hopes of tracking the recipients. Sarah accessed her trust fund and wired $400,000 to an offshore account, effectively bankrupting herself to save a man who had betrayed her in every possible way. David was released 36 hours after the money transfer was confirmed, dumped at a highway rest stop 50 miles from the city. He was physically unharmed but emotionally shattered by his experience. The first thing he did upon gaining access to a phone was call Sarah to thank her for saving his life. The conversation was brief and painful. David confirmed everything Sarah had suspected, and more. He admitted to the affair, the financial crimes, and the plan to use her trust fund. He also revealed that he had been threatened and coerced into deeper criminal involvement, but acknowledged that his initial choices had been motivated by greed rather than fear. "I know I can never make this right," David said during their final phone conversation, "but I want you to know that somewhere along the way, I did fall in love with you for real. That part wasn't fake, even though everything else was." Sarah hung up without responding. Love wasn't enough to overcome the magnitude of David's betrayals and the danger he had brought into her life. The aftermath was complex and long-lasting. The FBI investigation led to multiple arrests within the Benedetti organization, including Tony and Francesca. David cooperated with law enforcement in exchange for witness protection, disappearing into a new identity and location. Sarah filed for annulment immediately, citing fraud and deception as grounds for voiding the marriage. The legal process was complicated by the criminal investigation, but ultimately successful. She was single again, though financially devastated and emotionally scarred. The mansion venue refused payment for the wedding, recognizing that the event had been ruined by circumstances beyond Sarah's control. Many of the wedding vendors also waived their fees out of sympathy for her situation. The community support helped Sarah financially, but couldn't undo the trauma of discovering that her entire relationship had been built on lies. Elena extended her stay in the United States to help Sarah through the most difficult period of recovery. Together, they packed up the apartment Sarah had shared with David, donating the wedding gifts and removing all traces of their life together. The media attention was intense for several weeks, with local news outlets covering the wedding kidnapping story extensively. Sarah declined most interview requests, preferring to process her experience privately with the help of a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. 6 months later, Sarah had rebuilt her life on a smaller but more authentic scale. She moved to a different city to escape the constant reminders of her ordeal and started her interior design business fresh. The experience had taught her to trust her instincts and ask harder questions about the people she allowed into her life. The trust fund money was never recovered, but Sarah discovered she was stronger and more resilient than she had ever imagined. She learned that her worth wasn't measured by her family's wealth or her ability to provide for others, but by her own character and determination. David occasionally sent messages through intermediaries, expressing continued remorse and asking about her well-being. Sarah never responded. She had forgiven him for her own peace of mind. But forgiveness didn't require maintaining any form of relationship with someone who had caused such profound harm. The Benedetti family members involved in the kidnapping received significant prison sentences, bringing some sense of justice to the situation. Francesca, in particular, was convicted of multiple felonies related to both the kidnapping and the underlying money laundering operation. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of truly knowing someone before making major life commitments. She sometimes spoke to women's groups about recognizing red flags in relationships and trusting intuitive warnings about potential partners. The wedding dress was donated to a charity that provided formal wear to women who couldn't afford it for special occasions. Sarah kept only her engagement ring, which she had melted down and redesigned into a pendant that served as a reminder of her survival and resilience. Years later, Sarah would reflect that her worst day had ultimately led to her strongest and most authentic life. The nightmare wedding had destroyed her illusions, but revealed her true character and the depth of love provided by her family and real friends. She never remarried, but built meaningful relationships based on honesty and genuine connection rather than fantasy and deception.